Welcome to Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial, albeit kind of remotely like today, like this. What we're going to do is do pretty much what we do with school groups who are here on field trips when they come to the site. We are in southern Indiana, and we preserve the site where Abraham Lincoln lived between the ages of 7 and 21. So when you first arrive at the park, most visitors begin their visit here at the Memorial Visitor Center. This building is a very impressive stone building that was built here in the 1940s. And this is where we start our tours, and we give most of our orientation for let people know what there is to see and do in the park. All right, so like I say, this is the visitor center. This is where we start our visit to the park. We will go on inside. This is the Abraham Lincoln Hall. This is where we generally begin all of our programs with the school groups when they come to the park. We come in here and we visit a little bit and see about Abraham Lincoln and his time here in Indiana. Now, Abraham Lincoln, as most of you probably already know, was born in Kentucky in 1809. In fact, yesterday, February 12th, was his birthday. And he lived in the state of Kentucky for 7 years until his father decided to move the family here to Indiana. His father was Thomas Lincoln. Thomas Lincoln decided to move the family here from Kentucky primarily because he had had problems in Kentucky with getting clear title to his land. And there had been a couple of instances in which he had lost his farm. So he decided to move his family north of the Ohio River to Indiana, where he could get clear title to his land. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln's mother. There were 4 members of the Lincoln family: Thomas Lincoln, Nancy Hanks, Abraham, and then Abraham had an older sister, Sarah, who was 2 years older. Those were the 4 members of the Lincoln family who moved here. Now, when they came here in 1816, this part of Indiana looked much differently than it does now. It was all forested. Thomas Lincoln was a farmer, and he wanted to grow corn and other crops, but you can't really do that in the woods, so he had to start clearing the land. And Abraham, even though he was only 7 years old, was given an axe and put to work chopping down trees to help his father clear the land. See, there were other people living in Indiana at the time, in this part of Indiana at the time, but there weren't very many of them. And so everybody in the family really had to pitch in and work together in order for the family to get by. So Abraham began chopping down trees when he was 7 years old, and he did that for the entire 14 years that the family was here in Indiana. Because you didn't do it just once and you were done, you had to keep working at it year after year. So he got very good at using an axe. Carried an axe around with him pretty much everywhere he went. There was always some sort of clearing work needed to be done. So he learned at an early age, how important it was to work hard. But he also learned that he didn't want to be a farmer when he grew up. He said, the things I want to know are in books. It meant he needed to get an education. That was kind of a challenge in this area at the time, because most of the grown-ups who lived around here did not know how to read and write. So it made it difficult to find a teacher. But occasionally there would be someone who would move into the community, start a school, and Abraham could go. Now these schools were what they called blab schools, meaning that all the kids, all ages, were all in one room together, but they would be reading aloud from different books. So there would just be all this noise and all this confusion going on. Probably not the most effective way to learn things, but Abraham was eager to get whatever education he could. Now, he didn't go to school quite the same way as you guys do. He didn't go 5 days a week for 9 months out of the year. He said he went to school by littles. a little bit here and a little bit there. Because remember, there's still all that work on the farm that has to be done. So if it's planting time or if it's harvest time, it's more important that he be on the farm doing the work that needed to be done there. So he went to school by littles. He said if you would add up all those little bits of time over the whole 14 years that he lived here, it would have been less than 1 full year. So not a lot of formal schooling. But he didn't know how to read, and he liked to read. In fact, he would read pretty much every chance he got, anything he could get a hold of. Weren't a lot of books available at the time, so he would borrow books from neighbors that had them. And oftentimes he would read these books over and over again. And the things he read in these books really made a big impression on him. Most of the books he was reading were biographies or about American history. At that time was primarily books about the American Revolution. So he's reading about people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. And he realizes in reading these books that these early patriots had made a lot of sacrifices to create the United States in the first place. And it really made a big impression on him that if they were willing to even sacrifice their lives if necessary for this idea of democracy and liberty, and that meant it must be something pretty special about that. Now, he's reading these books when he's young, but when he becomes an adult later on, he remembers the things that he's read, because when Abraham Lincoln, we all know, he goes on to become president of the United States at a time when the country is going through the crisis of the Civil War, or part of the country wants to secede from the rest of it. And Abraham Lincoln has to decide how he's going to react to that. What's he going to do? Let the people who want to secede go, or is he going to try to keep the country united? And what he ultimately decides, of course, is to try to keep the country united. And part of what helped him make that decision was just remembering things he read in those books when he was growing up. He figured if these patriots had made all these sacrifices, then he had a responsibility to try to make sure that the country stayed together. So it's one of those examples of how something that was part of his life while he lived here in Indiana shows up later on in his life. So he was constantly carrying a book around and reading. In fact, people said that if you saw him out and about in the neighborhood, he'd have an axe in one hand, so he could do the work he needed to do, but when he got a chance to take a break, he could sit down and he could read. He understood that it was important to work hard, do the physical work. He also wanted to learn as much as he could from the books. All right, so after we have sat here in the Abraham Lincoln Hall and talked for a few minutes, we're going to go out, and just outside the hall, there is this bust of Abraham Lincoln. Now, you might notice something missing here, and I'm not talking just about his body and his arms and legs and all. But look very closely at his face. Anybody tell me what is missing there? What was that? I think I heard it. His beard, right, his beard. Most pictures that we see of Abraham Lincoln, he has a beard, doesn't he? But he really only had that beard for the last 4 or 5 years of his life. Most of his adult life, he was clean shaven, as he is in this statue. There's a story about how he came to grow his beard. He was running for president in 1860. There was a little girl by the name of Grace Bedell wrote him a letter. Told him, she said, "Mr. Lincoln, I think you're a good man, and I think you'll make a fine president. The problem is you're not very attractive. You're just really not very attractive. And I think if you were to grow a beard, that might make you look better, and it might then cause more people to vote for you." So Abraham Lincoln was so taken by her letter that he went ahead and he grew the beard. A little later on, he met Grace Bedell and told her that she was the reason why he grew the beard. So he really only had his beard during his presidency, but of course most of the photographs that were taken of him after he was president. So it's just a little something I like to point out that a lot of people may not know about him. Now we'll go on down the hallway here. This is a long hallway that connects the room we were just in with the room that we're going to end up in here in just a few minutes. And along this hallway, we have a lot of different displays up, and we have a lot of photographs and drawings and sketches and all of Abraham Lincoln down through here. These are all on loan to us. There's a gentleman who lives here in Indiana who started collecting these things about 40 years ago, has a collection of thousands of them. He loans different ones of them to us to have on display here. So when I have school groups here and we're walking down through the hall, I like to then have them take a look at the pictures and tell me which ones he was president and which ones he wasn't president, because you can tell by whether he has the beard or not. So we'll go on into the museum. We have different displays in here about Abraham Lincoln's time here in Indiana, but then also about his time after he left Indiana, because it's all part of the same story, of course. And if you look around in the museum, you probably notice that we don't have a lot of objects. We don't have a lot of things here on display. But and that's unfortunate, but there's a couple of pretty good reasons for that. First of all, you have to remember, Abraham Lincoln didn't live his entire life in Indiana. Does anybody know where he moved to after he left Indiana?
Kentucky.
Yeah, he was born in Kentucky, moved to Indiana, but then from Indiana he moved to Illinois. Okay. Now, when you move from one place to another, what do you do with your stuff?
He took it off. Take it with you.
Most of the time you're going to pack it up and take it with you, right? Yeah. So that's what the Lincolns did. They packed up stuff and they took it with them. But even if they had left it here, I mean, probably nobody would have kept it and hung on to it. Because remember, Abraham Lincoln, he was 7 when he moved here. He was 21 when he moved away. Was he president of the United States yet? Not then. In fact, he wasn't anybody famous at all at that point. So it never occurred to him or to anybody else that they should be saving any of his stuff. I mean, think about yourselves for a minute. One of you in this classroom today might someday be president of the United States. And it's possible that the home that you live in right now might someday be a national park or a museum. And it could be school kids just like you coming through your house to see how you lived when you were this age. Okay? Just as possible for you as it was for Abraham Lincoln. But I kind of doubt any of you are going to go home tonight, take off the shoes you're wearing right now and say, one of these days I'm going to be famous, I'm going to save these shoes for the museum. Any of you think you're going to do that? Probably not, see? And that was the way it was for Abraham Lincoln. He didn't think about saving any of his stuff, neither did anybody else. So for those two reasons, we don't really have a lot of things to put in our museum. Most of the stuff we have, like these tools, are just reproductions. They're like the tools he used to use. And he used tools like these, but these are not the exact same ones that he used. We don't have those anymore. But we have some of the stuff in here in our museum just to kind of help give you an idea of what his life was like. Okay. I'm going to talk about his mother here for just a few minutes, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. She's a very important person in his life. Unfortunately, she did not live very long after they moved to Indiana. She got sick and she died when Abraham was 9 years old. She died of a disease called the milk sickness. And the milk sickness was caused by this plant right here. This is called the white snakeroot plant. Now, it's a pretty innocent-looking plant, nice little white flowers on it and stuff. But this plant has a poison in it And if the cows got into this plant and ate enough of it, that poison could get into the cow's milk. And then if you drank the milk from the cow who had done that, then you get this disease called the milk sickness. And that's what happened to Abraham's mom, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, when he was 9 years old. Now, we think probably what happened was that it was the neighbor's cow that got into the plant, because we know she went to help take care of the neighbors who were sick and probably ended up drinking some of the same poisoned milk. Now, we understand now how this all works, that it's the poison in the plant that gets in the milk and all. But the pioneers didn't really understand that at the time. So she didn't know not to drink the milk. So when Abraham was 9 years old, his mother died of the milk sickness. That left Thomas Lincoln and Abraham and his sister Sarah without a wife and without a mother. And it was a pretty rough time for the family. Thomas, of course, is still trying to take care of the farm, do all the things he needs to do there. And Sarah, who is only 11 years old at this point, has to try to take up doing a lot of the chores in the cabin and all that her mother had been doing before. So it was a pretty tough time in their life. And Thomas decided finally that he was going to get remarried. And he went back to Kentucky, and he married a woman by the name of Sarah Bush Johnston. Now, this picture was taken much later in her life. She would have been younger than this when they got married. But she had been married before. She was a widow woman who had 3 kids from that first marriage. So Thomas went to her and he said, "Well, you're a widow woman and you've got 3 kids, and I don't have a wife and I've got 2 kids. Why don't we get married?" She thought that was a good idea, and so they did. And she and her kids then came from Kentucky, moved up here to Indiana, live with Thomas and his 2 kids. Sarah Johnston Lincoln, she became a very important person in Abraham Lincoln's life. She really picked up and helped out where, his fill the hole that had been left when his mother had died. And one of the ways she did this was she encouraged him to read as well. In fact, Thomas had already told her that Abraham liked to read. So when she came from Kentucky here to Indiana, she brought several books with her, and she gave those to Abraham as a present. That was a really big deal for him. First of all, it was new books to read, but also it let him know that she was going to continue to encourage him just like his mother had. So they became very close. He always called her his mother, and she always called him her son. And in 1860, after he had been elected president, before he moved to Washington, D.C., one of the things he wanted to do was go and visit her one last time. And it turned out that was the last time that they got to see each other, because in 1865, of course, he was shot and killed. So she was an important person in his life. All right, now, the room we started out in was the Abraham Lincoln Hall. The room that we're in now is called the Nancy Hanks Lincoln Hall, named for his mother. Now, the 2 rooms look quite a bit differently. The first one looked a lot more formal. A lot of people even say it looks like a church. And that's because the people who built it felt like, Abraham Lincoln, pretty important person in our country's history. They needed to have something pretty formal and dignified for him. But they wanted to honor his mother, too. But they made this room a little less formal. They put the fireplace in and the table and the chairs and all here just to kind of give us a feeling of home, because that was where Nancy had the biggest influence on Abraham, in the home. So this is the Nancy Hanks Lincoln Hall. Now, there's this painting above the fireplace here that was done especially for this room. Does anybody know what river that is in that painting?
Ohio.
Exactly. The Ohio River was pretty important during Abraham Lincoln's time here in Indiana. That's the river they crossed to get here from Kentucky. And we believe this painting is of the place where they crossed the river to get here to Indiana in 1816. And remember, we talked earlier about how this area was all very heavily forested. Probably would have looked a lot like it does in this painting. You can imagine if you were a farmer moving into an area like this, how much work you were going to have to do just to clear the land before you could even plant your crops. Now, when Abraham was a teenager, he spent some time down along the Ohio River, cutting firewood and doing various other kinds of jobs, making a little extra money. But he didn't keep that money for himself. He brought it home and he gave it to his family, to his father, to help out the family. So that was one way he could help out. When he was 18, he took a trip down this river. Kind of hard to see right here, but just a little flatboat right here in the river. He would have taken a flatboat trip down the Ohio River, he and a friend of his, Alan Gentry. They went down the Ohio to the Mississippi River and all the way down to New Orleans. That was a big adventure for him. First time he'd ever really been away from home. First time he'd ever seen a big city. And it was the first time he ever saw a slave auction. New Orleans and Louisiana were in that part of the country, of course, where the slavery existed. And they would have these sales on the street where they would sell people to various plantations. And Abraham, who saw this, his friend Alan Gentry said later that it really upset Abraham Lincoln to see these families being sold into slavery and to being split up. But of course, he's an 18-year-old kid, and there's really not anything he can do about it at that point in time. But later on in his life, he becomes president. Now, as president of the United States, he is in a position to do something about slavery. And what he does is he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the South. And then later he worked to get a new law passed, 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery forever. Now, we don't know exactly everything he was thinking when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's not too hard to imagine that one of the things that may have crossed his mind was he remembered seeing that slave auction and how he wished he could do something about it then. He couldn't then, but now he can as president. So it's another one of those examples of how something that was part of his life while he lived here in Indiana has an impact on his life later on. All right, we're going to go on back outside now. Take another quick look at the building. The Abraham Lincoln Hall, first room we were in, is off to the right here. The Nancy Hanks Hall that we were just in is off to the left. And you see these panels on the outside. These are sculptures on the outside of the building. Each of these represents a different place where Abraham Lincoln lived. This was Kentucky, Indiana. When we skip over here, this is Illinois, and then Washington, D.C. It's kind of hard to see with the sun on it there. And then the one in the middle, just kind of symbolic of Abraham Lincoln being a citizen of the world. So each of these panels here on the outside of the building, and then above them, there are inscriptions from different speeches that Abraham Lincoln made in his life. So this is the outside of what we call the Memorial Visitor Center. Now we're going to turn around and head away from the building, up toward the hillside where the grave of his mother is at. Along the way, we'll pass a flagpole here. Flagpole is 120 feet, 6 inches tall. It is, as far as we know, the tallest flagpole in the National Park System. Just past the flagpole here in the woods, we come across a little cemetery where Nancy Hanks Lincoln is buried. Now, when Nancy Hanks Lincoln died in 1818, there really wasn't an official cemetery for the community. But her and some of the other people who died at the same time were all buried on this little hill. It was just south of the cabin. And probably, almost certainly, the family would have put some sort of a marker on the gravesite, probably a wooden cross of some kind. But then when the family moved away in 1830, we don't know exactly what happens with the grave. We do know that by the time of Abraham Lincoln's death in 1865, it's reported that there is no marker on his mother's grave. And there were several newspaper articles written about this saying, well, there really should be a marker on her grave. And after one of those articles, a gentleman sent some money down and paid to have this headstone put on her grave. This was in 1879. Now, we don't know exactly if she's buried right underneath that stone or not, because there were never any records kept on the cemetery. But we do know that she's buried there on the hill. So we'll go down over the hill down to what we call the cabin site memorial. Now, during the whole 14 years that they lived here, we think the Lincolns probably had 3 different cabins. And this is what we think was probably the third or the last of the cabins. We know that Abraham and Thomas began building a cabin in 1829, but then they decided to move in 1830, so they didn't actually finish it. They sold it. People who bought it finished it and lived in it, but we think this is a location of that third cabin. People came around asking some of the older residents later. They pointed out this spot and said they thought it was here. Now this is actually a bronze casting that goes around. These aren't the original hearthstones and logs, but it just kind of makes an outline here of where the cabin was at. Now, right next to this cabin site memorial is our living history farm. This is a farm that was built by the National Park Service. It's not original, and it's not meant to be a reconstruction of the Lincoln farm necessarily, but it is on the site of the Lincoln farm. So we have a log cabin and smokehouse and various other buildings here. And for about 6 months out of the year, in spring and summertime, we have some of our park rangers at the cabin dressed in pioneer clothes, and they are working there to explain what it was like to live in a log cabin. So you come on a visit, you can actually come into the cabin and see the various ways furnished and certain different things that people are doing there. And I like to say this cabin's not original, but we think it's probably about the same size as the cabin that the Lincolns had. So it's just a one-room log cabin. And keep in mind that after Thomas got married to Sarah Johnston and she brought her kids, then there were like 8 different people living in this cabin. So they were a close family because they didn't have any other choice but to be close. But it was, people lived their life differently then than we do now. They didn't spend as much time inside as we do. Really coming inside, they come inside to eat, and they come inside to sleep. But most of the rest of the time they were outside. And there were advantages to having a small cabin like this. For one thing, it was easier to build because you didn't have to chop down as many trees for it. And also, it was easier to heat. Their only source of heat was the fireplace. Having a small cabin was certainly easier to heat up and keep it warm. So this is the cabin that we have. We also have a barn and other kind of buildings here. We do have some livestock on the farm. We generally have a couple of horses, a couple of cows, a few sheep, chickens, that sort of thing. Just to kind of give it a feel of a farm. This is a carpenter shop. This is one thing that probably would have been unique to the Lincoln farm, because Thomas Lincoln, besides being a farmer, was a carpenter. And so he would have needed to have a place where he could work on building his furniture and various other kinds of things. So we have a carpenter shop, and we do demonstrations to show how some of the tools were used. So like I say, we have some of our park rangers that are dressed like pioneers. This is one of our rangers. He put together a program about the Blab School. And so he did some research and found out what kind of materials they used, what kind of lessons and stuff. And so then he has people work through those things and do it the same way as Abraham Lincoln did growing up. We do other demonstrations and things. Here they're washing wool. Oftentimes we have sheep on our farm. They will shear the sheep, wash the wool, card the wool, spin the wool, and use it to make various things. And visitors come and oftentimes try their hand at doing some of these things as well. This young man here is trying out splitting rails. Abraham Lincoln was known as the rail splitter because he became very good at splitting rails. And so we give people a chance to try their hand at it and see if they can do it as well as he did. So we have a variety of activities going on at the farm, and it's all to kind of help give you an idea of what pioneer life was like, what it was like for Abraham Lincoln growing up on a farm very much like this. Now, after visiting the farm, we can go back to the visitor center again on what we call our Trail of 12 Stones. And at various points along the trail, there are stones from different buildings associated with Abraham Lincoln's life. This stone on the left was one that was put up here as one of the early memorials to the park, to Abraham Lincoln at the park, and this is from another building associated with him as well. So we have a variety of experiences that you can have here at the park. You can have park ranger in uniform that usually will do the programs down at the visitor center and that sort of thing. We have a little bookshop here. We show a movie, 15-minute movie, people who come. And so a lot of times a lot of school groups will picnic while they're here. So there's a lot of different things to do while you're here to give you a chance to learn about Abraham Lincoln and about his time here in Indiana. So, and the thing about his time here is that, it was really a pretty important time in his life. Things that happened to him during the 14 years he was living here really had a big impact on him later and helped decide what kind of a grown-up he would become. We talked about how the books that he read helped him make decisions later as president, and how his experience of seeing the slave auction helped him become determined to do something about slavery if he ever got a chance to do that. So some of these experiences, there were different people in his lifetime here that had a big impact on him. Learned a lot of things, a lot of practical things from his father. But he also learned some other things from his dad as well. For instance, does anybody know of a nickname that Abraham Lincoln had? Honest Abe, right. He got the nickname Honest Abe because he was known for, he had a reputation for being a very honest man. Well, he really learned that from his dad. People who knew his dad always described him as a very honest man. And Abraham, as a young boy, could see how people liked and respected his father because of his honesty. And so he tried to copy that same behavior and apparently became pretty good at it, or he wouldn't have become known as Honest Abe. So a lot of things, not just things that he learned like how to work, but a lot of kind of his characteristics and things that became part of his personality were formed during this time that he was living here in Indiana. And it's kind of important to think about because you guys, all of you, are between the ages of 7 and 21. And whether you realize it or not, you're going through the same kind of thing right now in your life that Abraham Lincoln did when he was living here. In other words, things that you're learning now and experiences that you're having now and people who are important to you now, all of that is going to help decide what kind of a grown-up you become as well. So in that respect, you're just like Abraham Lincoln was when he was living here in Indiana. So it's just something to think about. Abraham Lincoln sometimes seems like a larger-than-life figure. But there was a time when he was just a boy growing up here in Indiana on the frontier and learning how to live life just like all the rest of it. So that's a quick tour of Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial. Does anybody have any questions about anything?
What you'd like typed in over there.
If you have any questions, come up here.
Yeah, get in the line there.
And just talk into this microphone.
Yeah, they do. When you all say
Guys.
they activate.
Oh, okay.
I think it's best.
Does anyone have questions?
No. What?
Did I tell you everything you ever wanted to know about Abraham Lincoln?
Okay. Does anyone have any questions?
Mm-hmm.
You already said that.
Yeah, that's not the question. Yes.
I can hear you through the microphone.
What?
There's some kid asking.
What was the name of the doctor that supposedly helped John Wilkes Booth escape?
That was Dr. Samuel Mudd. That was his name.
Thank you.
Ask if that railroad by his house was there when they moved there, or they added that railroad track later.
I'm sorry, I think there was a question there, but I couldn't quite hear it.
Was the railroad track by his house there when he moved, or did they add it?
No, that was done later. The railroad came through in the 1870s after the Lincolns had already left Indiana. But it is still here.
We'll talk a little bit more about the sister who died and their relationship.
So, you mentioned his sister Sarah. How did Sarah influence Abe?
Okay. Question about Abraham Lincoln's sister Sarah, but I didn't quite catch what the question was. I'm sorry.
Their relationship.
So,
How was their relationship?
how did Sarah affect Abe?
Okay. You talking about his sister?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, Abraham and his sister were very close. They were only a couple of years apart, and especially after their mother died, they spent a lot of time just the two of them, and they became very close to one another. Unfortunately, while they were living in Indiana, his sister died as well. She had gotten married. She was pregnant with her first child, and something went wrong when she was giving birth, and her and the baby both died. So that was really hard on Abraham too.
You're asking your questions about me. So did Abraham Lincoln have any, did he just chop down trees, or did he have any other jobs? And his dad, what did his dad do when he was alone? When Mary, or whatever, when Abraham's mother died.
Yeah, okay. Well, Abraham did have other jobs. I mean, he helped clear the land. He helped his father plant the crops. He helped his father harvest the crops. He also helped his dad in the Carpenter Shop when he was building furniture and that sort of thing. Now, Thomas Lincoln, his dad, it was hard on him when Nancy died as well. And that was one of the reasons why he went to Kentucky looking for a new wife and married Sarah Bush Johnston.
So I heard a conspiracy theory or a book about how John Wilkes Booth also chased down the Secretary of State and Ulysses S. Grant. Is that true after he assassinated Abraham Lincoln?
Well, there was a conspiracy. There was John Wilkes Booth and a number of other people had gotten together and decided that they were going to not only kill the president, They were going to kill the vice president. They were going to kill the secretary of state and several other people. John Wilkes Booth, his job was to kill Abraham Lincoln. Some of the other peoples who were supposed to kill some of the others either were all unsuccessful. The only one who was successful in actually carrying out their mission of killing anybody was John Wilkes Booth.
How many days after Abraham Lincoln's assassination was John Wilkes Booth caught?
It was probably within a couple of weeks. I don't remember the exact number of days.
At what age did Abraham Lincoln, his sister, his mother, and father died at?
How old were they when they died? Is that what you're
Yes.
asking? Okay. Well, Abraham Lincoln was 56 years old when he died. His mother was 38 years old. His sister was 20 years old. And his father, I believe, was about 70 years old.
Does anyone else have a question? No. Any other questions? Okay. It's Ethan R. Was Benjamin Lincoln one of the ancestors of Abraham Lincoln?
I believe there was a Benjamin Lincoln that was part of the Lincoln family, yes.
Yeah,
I don't
he was
remember I don't remember the exact relationship, but I think he was part of the family.
Got it. Any other questions?
Would 70 years would it have been considered a long time for living as a
70
pioneer?
years? Yeah, that would have been considered quite a long time, yes.
Does anyone else have a question?
No.
Answered all your questions?
No more questions? Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
You can see us. Come over here. Say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
You have a good afternoon.
Look at
I'm sorry.
And then go to the Bye.
Bye-bye.